If you refuse, we will no longer consider you part of this family. We'll cut all ties with you. This message from my mother appeared on my phone screen, cold and absolute, like a final ultimatum. A few minutes later, my father followed up. Support Madison's dream. That's your responsibility, isn't it? It was a flawless act of coordination, like a team of seasoned con artists, but they still hadn't realized that the person they were trying to threaten was no longer the same me they used to know. The whole incident had started just a few minutes earlier, from a text sent by my cheerful and excited younger sister, Madison, and it came with a photo attached. It was a photo of a bright red sports car worth $300,000 gleaming in a showroom. She flashed a peace sign while standing beside it, as if she had just conquered the entire world. I did it. My dream is coming true. Then came the next sentence, one that made my stomach freeze. I already signed the contract. I told them you'd be my co-signer and the pre-approval went through. I signed all my parts, so all that's left is your signature. I told the dealer you agreed, so they'll probably call you soon to confirm. No prior discussion, no permission, nothing. That's her way. She dives headfirst into a pool of reckless desire with our parents cheering her on, and I'm left to clean up the financial mess. For years, I was the family's safety net, their personal bank, and the ultimate problem solver. Yet, as I stared at the screen, my heart was eerily calm. The anger and sorrow had long since burned away, leaving behind only a cold, solid certainty. Sitting on the leather sofa, I could feel how the quietness of my home stood in sharp contrast to the chaos they were trying to create. I slowly began to type my reply. I don't mind being your co-signer, Madison, but I'm certain there's one thing you've forgotten. I pressed send. The message was marked as read almost instantly, but no reply came. They were probably stunned by my unexpected composure. They had forgotten one crucial fact. To take out a loan, you need assets, and they no longer had a single one to offer. The house they lived in, the car my father drove, every legal right to those belonged firmly under my name. Yes, the show had only just begun. My name is Haley, 38 years old. I work as a financial analyst. I built my wealth with my own hands, pay every bill before the due date, and live in complete financial independence. Meanwhile, my younger sister Madison was already 32, but she never held a steady job, always begging our parents for money under the excuse that she was going to be an influencer, only to lose interest in a few months and chase her next dream. And then there were our parents. They had always spoiled Madison to an absurd degree, and that blind favoritism had fatally distorted the entire family's sense of money. How could they make such audacious demands of me? The root cause went back 10 years ago. My father had taken out a $500,000 home equity loan using our house as collateral to invest in a poorly planned import business. It failed spectacularly. That was the beginning, the moment I stepped into the bottomless swamp of my family's financial troubles. When the bank sent a foreclosure notice, I emptied all the savings I had built up since starting my career and paid off their enormous debt. At first, I was driven purely by the desire to save my family. I naively believed that once they saw how serious things had become, they would wake up and rebuild their lives. But that hope was shattered almost immediately. Despite losing most of their assets, their lifestyle didn't change one bit. If anything, perhaps out of guilt for their failure, my parents began spoiling Madison even more. Their favorite phrase was, "We don't want her to suffer." When Madison said, "I want to run my own boutique," they handed her the little they had left. Even when that money vanished into luxury handbags, they said nothing. In time, they became a complete financial black hole, and filling that hole somehow became my role. Any words of gratitude for my first rescue disappeared quickly, replaced by an unspoken belief that my support was their right. My parents' medical bills, home repairs, every kind of expense found its way to me as if it were perfectly natural. If I refused, my mother would cry, my father would yell, and Madison would post on social media calling me a cold, heartless person. I gave in to that emotional blackmail and kept paying. But from that moment on, distrust toward them began to grow inside me. Quietly, yet steadily. One day, I realized something. What I was giving them wasn't money. I was giving them the grace period to remain irresponsible. If things continued this way, we would all go down together. I had to act, not to protect them, but to protect myself. From that day on, I began consulting a lawyer and started legally organizing their assets. And in return for taking over the debt, I had my father sign the following documents: promissory note, deed of trust, and quitclaim deed. They were simply relieved that their immediate debt had vanished, and they signed everything I placed before them without a second thought. They never truly considered what those papers meant. It was obvious they didn't understand the implications. To them, it was just another temporary procedure to fix yet another financial problem. But from that moment on, I was, in the eyes of the law, the owner of the house. That carelessness proved extremely useful in carrying out my plans smoothly. On the night the title transfer was finalized, I called my parents. When I told them, "From now on, I'll manage all debt payments directly," my father sounded relieved. "Oh, that's a huge help," he said happily. They had no idea that the ownership of their home legally belonged to me from then on. For me, that was the first safety net. It was the minimum layer of protection, ensuring they couldn't recklessly dispose of their assets if things went wrong. Madison was even more indifferent. She didn't care at all about our parents' financial situation. She was only thinking about satisfying her own desires. Even if she heard that I ended up holding the rights to the house, she'd probably just shrug and say, "So? What does that have to do with me?" In her world, money simply appears from somewhere, and she vaguely assumes I'm the one controlling the faucet. This unbalanced relationship has lasted for years. I earn, they spend. I plan, they live carelessly off the results. Whenever I try to set boundaries, they break them down with emotional arguments like, "Why are you being so cold to your own family?" I needed to destroy this distorted structure entirely. That's why the recent sports car incident was the perfect opportunity for me. But why had I lost all faith in them to begin with? Everything started with that one event 5 years ago, back when I still believed they were my family. That incident was the moment I truly woke up from the illusion of family. At the time, I was studying hard for an MBA to advance my career, saving $20,000 for tuition fees and living expenses. It was my dream, my sanctuary, something I didn't want anyone to interfere with. When I told my family about my plan, they all praised me. "That's amazing. You can do it, Haley," they said. But I didn't yet realize how empty those words really were. One weekend, when I returned home from a short trip, something about the atmosphere in the house felt off. My parents were being unusually kind to me, while Madison avoided meeting my eyes. A sense of dread ran through me, and I immediately checked my bank balance. Then I froze. The $20,000 that should have been there was almost completely gone. With a trembling voice, I confronted my parents. They had exercised their rights as joint account holders and withdrawn every cent of my savings, without my permission. "Madison really wanted to go to Paris," my mother sobbed. "All her friends are going. How could we let her be the only one left behind? You can always save the money again, can't you?" my father said defensively. They had trampled my dream, without a shred of guilt, for the sake of Madison's fleeting vanity. It was theft in one of its most despicable forms, too murky to be easily condemned by law. In that moment, something inside me broke completely. They were no longer my family. They were predators, leeches feeding on my assets. After what I came to call the Paris trip incident, I packed my things and left the house. And for the first time in my life, I hired a lawyer on my own. My goal was to recover the stolen $20,000 and to build a legal wall that would forever prevent them from touching my finances again. I still remember sitting on the cold floor of my new apartment, flipping through the phone book in search of an attorney. I had reached my limit living in that house, constantly reading their moods. I realized that if I didn't create physical distance, my mind would collapse. "This isn't a family issue. It's a clear case of theft," the lawyer said firmly after I explained everything in his office. Those words solidified my resolve. When the attorney sent an official repayment demand, my family, predictably, fell into panic. "How could you do this to your own family? Are you trying to shame us in public?" my mother cried over the phone. "Have you forgotten everything we did for you?" my father shouted. But I refused to respond and told them all communication would go through my lawyer. Faced with my unwavering resolve and the threat of legal action, they finally gave in. A few weeks later, they broke into what little savings they had left and wired $20,000 into the account designated by my attorney. I didn't care where they got the money from. All that mattered was the fact that they had repaid it. That incident taught me an important lesson. Compassion and affection don't work on them. The only things they fear are their reputation and the force of the law. From that experience, I realized I needed to strengthen my defenses even further. First, I changed the passwords on all my bank accounts and enabled two-factor authentication. Then I set up strict monitoring alerts with the credit bureaus so that any new credit inquiries under my name would immediately notify me. The alert went off about 6 months after I'd left the house. Madison had tried to use my social security number to apply for multiple credit cards online. Fortunately, thanks to the alert system, the applications were automatically blocked before any real damage was done. When I confronted her with the proof, emails showing the fraud attempt, she said as if it were the most natural thing in the world, "But your credit score is great. You could get approved for anything. I was only going to borrow a little." In that moment, I knew for certain. She had no concept of guilt. I had enough evidence in my hands to report her to the police for identity theft. And I seriously considered it. But I stopped myself at the last second. Not out of sympathy. It was a cold, calculated decision to avoid the endless complications that would come from sending my own sister to prison. So I decided to give them one final chance as a family. But it wasn't about redemption. It was a final warning to ensure I would never fall victim to them again. The condition was simple: to build a complete wall that would prevent them from ever accessing my personal information, credit, or assets again. Half measures wouldn't work to sever this connection. The only solution was to bring every aspect of their financial life under my control. So I began to guide them, carefully and deliberately, into transferring all legal rights to their assets to me in exchange for me taking over their debts. Tempted by the sweet promise of instant relief, they signed the documents happily, without any understanding of what they were giving away. That marked the completion of the fortress I had spent 5 years building. As I recalled those events from 5 years ago, I slowly opened my eyes. The stolen MBA fund, the attempted fraud with my personal information, every one of their actions had been aimed at my assets. That's why I built a legal fortress. To protect what was mine. It was a defensive measure. Nothing more. A way to ensure they would never again invade my territory. Then, breaking the silence, my phone chimed with a new notification. On the screen was a message from Madison. "What do you mean by that? What do you mean I'm forgetting something?" So it had begun. Unable to understand the meaning of my reply, she had lost her patience. But this time, the situation was on a completely different level. This wasn't a simple case of begging for money. They had tried to sell off the very thing I had spent years building, my creditworthiness, slapping a price tag of $300,000 on it without my consent. As a financial analyst, my credibility is my life. If Madison ever defaulted on a payment, it would leave a permanent scar on my credit record. That could destroy my career from the ground up. They had no understanding of how serious that was. No, they didn't even try to understand. To them, my credibility, like my money, was an infinite resource they could freely tap into. For years, I had endured their attacks, deflected them, and built layers of defense. But now, I'd reached my limit. They had crossed a line that must never be crossed, and they'd done it without hesitation. This was the final ultimatum, not from me, but from fate itself. I would no longer protect them, nor would I hope for their redemption. All I would do was handle the situation, calmly and precisely, according to the rules I had established. The anger and sorrow I once felt were gone. All that remained was the cold determination of a surgeon performing a necessary operation. I would cut myself, and my future, free from the disease that called itself my family. And the operation would begin now. I stood up and walked toward my study. I already knew exactly who I needed to call first. The lawyer who had helped me 5 years ago. "Mr. Collins, it's been a while. This is Haley." Even though it had been 5 years since we last spoke, Mr. Collins recognized me immediately, his voice calm and steady. "I took your silence as a good sign," he said. At his words, I let out a dry, weary smile. "Unfortunately, this time I'm not calling for defense. I'm calling for offense," I began. I explained the situation about the sports car in concise terms, that Madison had listed me as her co-signer without my consent and had already proceeded with the contract, that my parents were threatening to disown me if I refused. Mr. Collins listened silently, and when I finished, he spoke in a calm yet resolute tone. "Haley, this is no longer a family dispute. This is attempted fraud and coercion. It could easily be pursued as a criminal case. His words only strengthened my resolve. But I told him, I'm not considering criminal charges at this point. What I want is a complete severance from them, financially, socially, permanently. Mr. Collins understood immediately. I see. You intend to exercise every legal right you have to its fullest extent. In that case, the course of action is clear. We began discussing the specific steps. First, we would send a certified letter to the car dealership, formally declaring that I had no intention of becoming a co-signer, thereby rendering the contract invalid. Next, we would reaffirm that I held full ownership of my parents' house and take legal steps to ensure they could never again use that asset as collateral for new debt. Finally, we would issue a written notice to Madison and my parents, officially terminating all financial support and instructing them to contact Mr. Collins directly for any future communication. By the time we hung up, my mind was crystal clear. There was no room for emotion. This was business. A cool-headed restructuring of my life's enterprise, protecting it from bad debt. The next morning, I took a personal day off work. My first stop was Mr. Collins' office. Together, we finalized 3 documents, one addressed to the dealership, one to Madison, and one to my parents. The letter to the dealership clearly stated that I had never consented to the co-signer agreement and bore no liability whatsoever. The notices to Madison and my parents included a detailed list of all prior financial support I had provided, formally declaring that as of that day, all assistance was permanently terminated, and that any future correspondence must go through Mr. Collins. At the bottom of each document, our signatures stood side by side. Leaving the law office, I headed straight for the post office. There, I mailed the 3 documents via certified mail, each with a return receipt request attached. It's a system that requires the recipient's signature upon delivery, and that signed receipt is mailed back to me as legal proof of delivery. While it doesn't verify the content of the letters themselves, it does establish, beyond dispute, who received the documents and when. In the United States, it's the most reliable way to provide formal legal notice. With that, the first legal move had been made. It would take about 1 or 2 days for the letters to reach their hands. In the meantime, I had another step to take. I went to my main bank and scheduled a meeting with my account manager. The purpose was to confirm, once and for all, the status of the mortgage on my parents' house. When I had assumed their loan years ago, the property had been officially re-registered under my name, and I held the first lien. In other words, the ownership of the house was entirely mine. The bank representative checked everything in the system and said firmly, "Yes, Miss Haley. Every right associated with this property belongs solely to you. Your parents cannot use this house as collateral for any loan without your explicit authorization." That settled it. I had complete certainty that they no longer had any way to borrow money from anyone but me. When I returned home, I saw a flood of frantic messages from Madison piling up on my phone. "Why aren't you answering your phone?" "What did you mean by forgetting something?" "The dealer says they can't move forward without hearing from you." I scrolled through them without emotion and deleted them all. You're no longer talking to the right person. You'll understand what that means soon enough. By the following afternoon, the notices must have reached them. Madison, of course, was the first to react. My phone began ringing incessantly, her name flashing on the screen over and over again. I didn't answer. I simply waited for the ringing to stop. As soon as the call ended, the barrage of text messages began. What is this supposed to mean? Who's this lawyer? You're kidding about cutting off support, right? Withdraw that letter right now. Her words radiated panic, confusion, and an utter inability to grasp the reality of what was happening. She'd probably heard from the dealer, too. Something along the lines of, "Since Miss Haley's consent could not be obtained, this contract is invalid." The $300,000 sports car she had almost secured had vanished before her eyes, like a mirage. She had likely never experienced such humiliation and disappointment in her entire life. I read through every message she sent, calmly confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Then, realizing there was nothing more to be gained from her, I quietly blocked her number entirely. She would never be able to call or text me again. Expecting my parents to reach out next, I switched my phone to silent mode. Sure enough, after a while, my mother's name appeared softly on the screen. I simply watched until the ringing stopped and the call went to voicemail. A few minutes later, a notification popped up. She had left a message. When I played it back, I heard her trembling voice through tears. Haley, please answer the phone. Madison's been crying and screaming. She's completely hysterical. What happened? That letter can't really be how you feel, can it? She still didn't understand. To her, this was nothing more than an extension of a petty sisterly quarrel. She had no grasp of how deep this problem truly ran. Finally, my father called. As before, I didn't answer and let it go to voicemail. His voice, when the message came through, was shaking with anger. Haley, are you trying to destroy this family? Fire that lawyer of yours and fix this right now. That's an order. His tone of authority hadn't changed at all since before I left home, but he still didn't know that his words no longer held any power over me. I just sat there in silence, staring at the messages and missed calls. They still hadn't faced real fear yet. They hadn't realized that the ground beneath them was nothing more than a castle built on sand. I could already predict their next move. They would rush to the bank to check their financial status. And that's when they would finally learn what the documents they had signed actually meant. That's where true despair would begin. The next day, I received a call from Mr. Collins. Just as expected, Haley, he said, a faint note of excitement in his voice. Your parents showed up at the bank first thing this morning. They wanted to verify the ownership of the house and asked if it could be transferred back into their names. Naturally, the bank politely but firmly told them no. I could picture the scene perfectly. At the low counter of the bank, my parents must have turned pale as they were confronted with the fact that they were no longer the owners of their home. The house they had lived in for decades, no longer theirs. For the first time, they must have truly felt the unbearable weight of that reality. Mr. Collins continued. And as for Madison, she's been contacted by the car dealership regarding potential fraud. They warned her about the legal consequences, and she's clearly shaken. It seems she even considered forging your signature. The dealership wants nothing more to do with her. Her $300,000 dream had turned into a nightmare of her own making. That evening, they finally showed up at my apartment. Through the intercom camera, I saw my parents, exhausted and pale, and Madison, her face twisted with rage. I didn't answer. They began pounding on the door, shouting my name. Haley, please, just hear us out. You're so cruel. I'll never forgive you. Please don't take the house away from us. Their voices were muffled through the thick door. I simply listened in silence. No tears, no anger. This was the inevitable consequence of their years of irresponsibility. I hadn't taken anything from them. They had lost everything by their own hands. After about 30 minutes of pounding, they finally gave up and left. The hallway fell silent, like the calm after a storm. But this wasn't the end. They still believed they had one final card to play. An emotional one. The card called family. A few days after the confrontation at my apartment, a letter arrived. It was from my mother. She had ignored the instruction to communicate only through my attorney and sent an emotional handwritten letter instead. Inside, she had included old family photos from when I was a child. The content was predictable, an appeal to sentimentality. Fond memories, talk of family bonds, and the line, "You used to be such a kind girl." Every word was carefully chosen to awaken my guilt. Meanwhile, Madison had started her own victim campaign on social media. Betrayed by my own family, I trusted them, and they took everything from me. With vague, emotionally charged words like those, she was trying to win sympathy and cast me as the villain. What happened? Your family. You should talk things out. Messages like that began arriving from relatives who had no real understanding of the situation. They were placing their last hopes on social pressure and my conscience. They thought that if enough people appealed to my emotions, I would eventually break down and say, "Fine, I'll forgive them." But they never understood, right up to the end, that from the very moment they stole my dream 5 years ago, any affection I had for them had vanished completely. Without hesitation, I fed my mother's letter and the old family photos into the shredder. Then I contacted Mr. Collins to handle the final step. It was an eviction notice for my parents' house. Of course, I didn't intend to throw them out onto the street immediately. I included the legally required grace period, along with a polite suggestion that they find a rental home more suited to their means. This wasn't punishment. It was their final chance to become financially independent, to stand on their own feet. When they received that notice, they would finally understand that I was serious and that there was no turning back. I blocked every possible line of communication and got a new phone number. It was the only way to sever all physical ties to my past. But even that wasn't enough. They still knew where I worked and where I lived. If I wanted true freedom, I needed to leave this place entirely. On the same day the eviction notice was mailed, I submitted my resignation at work. Fortunately, my skills were well recognized in the industry. I reached out to a West Coast company that had previously offered me a generous position. The negotiations went surprisingly smoothly, and within a month I had a new job waiting for me. There was almost no chance they could ever trace my new workplace. The following month passed in a blur. I asked Mr. Collins to handle the sale of the house. Then I sold or discarded most of my furniture, packing only the bare essentials into a few boxes. And like a quiet escape in the night, I left the city without telling anyone. 6 months have passed since I started my new life in this coastal town. Here, where the breeze from the Pacific drifts through the streets, no one knows who I used to be. The only calls I receive on my new phone are work-related or invitations from new friends. There are no more messages from old acquaintances or distant relatives. For the first time in my life, I had found true peace of mind. A few days ago, I received one final email from Mr. Collins, a closing report. The sale of the house had been completed successfully. My parents had moved into a small apartment within the city, and Madison had started working part-time at a luxury boutique. Their lives are surely not easy, but at last, they have reached the most basic starting line, the point where they are responsible for sustaining their own lives. Even as I read the report, I felt nothing. No hatred, no pity, no guilt. Only a distant detachment, as if I were reading about strangers in a foreign country. My life belongs to me. This freedom and peace. This is the reward I fought for all these years to finally claim.